Picture a hot Saturday afternoon in suburban Melbourne in 1965. Kids are playing cricket in the street while their dad tinkers with the Holden in the driveway. Mum's hanging clothes on the Hills hoist, and the smell of a lamb roast drifts from the kitchen window. Later, the family will walk to the local footy match, buy a meat pie at half-time, and walk home again as the sun sets. Nobody obsesses over their diet. Nobody counts calories. Nobody worries about getting fat. This was everyday life for most Australians in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Back then, seeing an overweight person was unusual enough that people would notice. In 1980, only 1 in 10 Australian adults was obese. Most people had what we'd now call a healthy weight without thinking about it. They ate proper meals, enjoyed their food, and almost never stepped foot in a gym. Today, the picture looks completely different. 2 out of 3 Australian adults are now overweight or obese. We have diet apps, fitness, trackers, and gym memberships, yet we're heavier than ever. Our grandparents stayed trim without any of these things. They didn't have nutritionists or personal trainers. They didn't do meal prep or count macros. So what changed? How did ordinary Australians stay naturally healthy for decades? Today, we're going back to the golden days of Australia to discover the surprising truth about how people lived and ate. Food rationing in Australia officially ended in 1950, but its effects lasted much longer. An entire generation had spent years making every scrap of food count. They'd gotten used to doing without butter, sugar, and meat whenever supplies ran low. My grandmother kept her sugar bowl locked in a cupboard until the day she died in 1982. She'd measure out 2 teaspoons for her morning tea, and that was it. Millions of Australian families were exactly the same. Waste was practically a sin. If you didn't finish your dinner, you heard about it. Leftovers from Sunday became Monday's meal. Stale bread became breadcrumbs or bread pudding. This careful approach to food meant portion sizes stayed modest. The average dinner plate in the 1960s measured about 23 or 24 centimetres across. Compare that to today's dinner plates, which are often 28 to 30 centimetres or bigger. That extra few centimetres makes a massive difference. Australian families in this era followed what they called meat and 3 vegetables. But here's the thing people forget. The meat portion was small. The vegetables were the real stars of the meal. Potatoes, carrots, peas, beans, pumpkin. These filled up your plate and filled up your stomach. The meat was there for flavour, not to dominate the meal like it does today. This approach made sense for practical reasons. Meat cost money, even in a country famous for sheep and cattle. Vegetables were cheap, especially if you grew them in your backyard. Many families had a veggie patch out back with tomatoes, lettuce, silver beet and beans. Some kept a few chooks for fresh eggs. Growing your own food wasn't some trendy lifestyle choice. It was just what you did to save money and feed your family properly. The mentality of making do and being careful with food created a natural brake on overeating. When sugar, butter, and meat had been rationed luxuries for so long, you didn't suddenly start buying 3 times as much when the restrictions lifted. My grandfather still spread butter so thin on his toast in the 1970s that you could barely see it. He'd been a young man during rationing, and that's how he learned to do it. His children learned the same habits from watching him. This frugal mindset extended beyond the dinner table. Treats were genuinely occasional. You didn't have biscuits sitting in the cupboard to grab whenever you felt like it. Shop-bought cakes were for birthdays and Christmas. If you wanted something sweet between meals, that was called spoiling your dinner, and your mother wouldn't have it. Children learned early that meals happened at set times and snacking wasn't part of the routine. The careful approach to food that started during the war years became part of Australian culture. Parents taught it to their children without making a fuss about it, and because everyone lived the same way, nobody felt deprived. Breakfast in an Australian household started much the same way across the country. A bowl of wheat bix with milk was standard fare for kids. Adults might have porridge in the cooler months, made with water or a splash of milk, and maybe a spoonful of golden syrup if you were lucky. Toast with Vegemite was another staple, always with a thin scrape of butter first, never laid on thick like today. That dark, salty spread was an Australian institution, and kids either loved it or learned to love it. Eggs were a weekend luxury for most families. A boiled egg on Sunday morning was something to look forward to. If you kept chooks in the backyard, you might have eggs more often, but even then, they were carefully rationed out through the week. The full cooked breakfast, bacon, eggs, sausages, tomatoes, and toast was a rare treat, maybe once a month at most. Working men doing heavy physical labour might grab a cooked breakfast at a cafe before their shift, but that was fuel for a day of hard yakka, not a leisurely meal. From 1951 to 1973, Australian schoolchildren got small bottles of milk delivered to their schools. You'd drink your little bottle at morning recess, often warm from sitting in the sun, and that was part of your daily nutrition. The government wanted to make sure kids got enough calcium and protein. Nobody worried about the fat content. Milk was milk, and it was good for you. Sunday roast was the centrepiece of the Australian week. Every Sunday, millions of families sat down to the same meal: a leg of lamb or a piece of beef, roasted potatoes, roasted pumpkin, peas or beans, and thick brown gravy made from the meat juices. This wasn't a casual meal. The table was set properly. The best tablecloth came out. After church, the family gathered together, and the father carved the meat at the table, serving thin slices to everyone. It was a ritual that brought families together. There were no televisions blaring in the background in the early years. You sat at the table, ate your meal, and talked to each other. The meal could last an hour or more, not because there was mountains of food, but because it was a social occasion. That Sunday joint of meat had to feed the entire family, so nobody got huge portions. The father got the biggest serving because he worked the hardest physically, but even his portion was modest by today's standards. The vegetables did most of the work of filling everyone up. A big pile of roasted pumpkin and potatoes with gravy over the top was delicious and satisfying. The meat added flavour and protein, but it didn't need to be the main event. Dessert after the roast was usually something simple and homey. Bread and butter pudding made from stale bread, eggs, milk, and a handful of sultanas. Baked apples stuffed with brown sugar and a tiny bit of butter. Steamed pudding with custard. On very special occasions, a pavlova topped with cream and passion fruit. These desserts were sweet enough to feel like a treat, but nothing like the sugar-loaded cakes and pastries you see today. The leftovers from Sunday became meals for the next few days. The early dinner time and lack of late-night eating created natural fasting periods overnight. Your body had 12 or 13 hours between finishing dinner and eating breakfast the next morning. This gave your digestive system a proper rest, though nobody thought about it in those terms. It was just the normal rhythm of daily life. Saturday morning was lolly money day for Australian kids. Your parents might give you sixpence or a shilling, and you'd head to the corner shop with your friends. The shopkeeper would have rows of big glass jars filled with different lollies. The brilliant thing was, this bag of lollies had to last the entire week. You didn't scoff them all on Saturday afternoon. You'd have a couple each day, rationing them out carefully, making them last until next Saturday came around. Violet crumbles, cherry ripes, and Freddo frogs existed, but chocolate bars were a once-a-week thing at most. You didn't buy them casually at the checkout like today. They cost money your parents didn't want to waste. A chocolate bar was something you saved for, thought about, and enjoyed slowly when you finally got one. The Chico roll appeared at the Wagga Show in 1951, invented in Bendigo as something you could eat with one hand at the footy. It was an occasional treat, greasy and filling, bought when you were out at a match or show. Tim Tams arrived in 1964 and quickly became an Australian favourite. But even Tim Tams were for special occasions in most households. You'd have them when visitors came over for afternoon tea, not as an everyday snack. Bakery treats followed the same pattern. Lamingtons, sponge cakes, vanilla slices, these were weekend or special occasion items. Soft drinks occupied a very different place in Australian life. Lemonade or passiona might appear at a birthday party or Christmas. Otherwise, most people drank tea, water, or milk. Cordial got diluted heavily and saved for special occasions. Afternoon tea was a daily ritual, but it wasn't a free-for-all. Around 4 o'clock, the kettle went on. You'd have a cup of tea and perhaps one biscuit or a thin slice of cake. This wasn't about filling up. It was about taking a break, having a chat, and tiding yourself over until dinner at 5 or 6. The predictability of afternoon tea, with its small, controlled portion, meant you weren't grazing all afternoon. You waited for that set time, enjoyed your treat, and then waited for dinner. Pubs had 6 o'clock closing until the laws changed in 1966 and 1967. This meant workers would rush to the pub after their shift ended, trying to get a few beers in before closing time. When BYO restaurants began appearing in 1965, it made dining out more affordable. You could bring your own wine to dinner rather than paying restaurant prices for alcohol. This sparked a small revolution in wine drinking in Australia. Before this, most Australians drank beer or spirits. Wine was for special occasions, often sweet wines like Barossa Pearl, which launched in 1956. Even as wine became more popular, drinking at home remained modest. You might have a bottle of sherry in the cupboard for visitors, but cases of wine weren't stacked in the garage. The key difference between treats then and now was their genuine scarcity. When you only had ice cream once a week, it meant something. When a chocolate bar cost pocket money you'd saved for days, you ate it slowly and made it count. When cake appeared only on weekends or birthdays, it felt like an occasion. This natural scarcity meant treats delivered actual pleasure. They stood out from everyday eating because they were different and rare. Today, treats have become so constant, they're barely treats anymore. We've lost that sense of anticipation and specialness. In the 1950s through the 70s, the structure of life, limited money, small freezers, set meal times, cultural expectations, created boundaries around sweet foods without anyone needing to consciously restrict themselves. The boundaries were simply there, built into how society worked. This was the reality for Australian families through the 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s. There were no shortcuts, no heating up a frozen lasagna, no ordering Uber Eats. If your family wanted dinner, someone had to peel the potatoes, chop the vegetables, and stand at the stove cooking. Usually that someone was Mum, and she spent a significant chunk of her day in the kitchen. This wasn't seen as unusual or unfair at the time. It was simply how households operated. Most married women didn't work outside the home in the 1950s. Their job was running the household, and cooking took up hours of that work. Breakfast needed making, school lunches needed packing, afternoon tea needed preparing, dinner required the most effort, peeling and chopping vegetables, preparing meat, watching pots on the stove, timing everything so it came together hot at the same time. Without modern appliances, even simple tasks took longer. No food processors to chop vegetables in seconds, no electric mixers for cakes. No dishwashers to clean up afterwards. Everything was done by hand. Potatoes were peeled with a small knife, one at a time. Carrots were scraped. Onions were diced on a wooden board. Your hands did all the work, and your arms got tired. The physical effort of cooking meant you appreciated the food more when it reached the table. You'd spent time and energy preparing it. You weren't going to waste it or treat it casually. Children learned to respect meals because they saw their mother working hard to put food in front of them. Complaints about what was served weren't tolerated. You ate what you were given or you went hungry. Traditional Australian dishes like shepherd's pie, rissoles, toad in the hole, and sausage casserole were popular because they were economical and filling. These meals used cheaper cuts of meat and stretched them with lots of vegetables, potatoes, or pastry. A little meat went a long way when you added plenty of other ingredients. The goal was to feed your family adequately without spending too much money. Cookbooks from this era reflect these priorities. The CWA cookbook, found in kitchens across Australia, contained practical recipes using basic ingredients. Fancy or exotic ingredients rarely appeared. You cooked with what was available locally and affordably. Flour, sugar, butter, eggs, milk, potatoes, root vegetables, seasonal fruits, and modest amounts of meat. If a recipe called for something unusual or expensive, most women skipped it or found a simpler alternative. The Women's Weekly magazine published the first spaghetti bolognese recipe for Australian readers in the 1950s, though it strangely included Worcestershire sauce. This shows how foreign Italian food was to most Australians at the time. Garlic was viewed with suspicion. Olive oil was something you bought at the chemist for earaches, not for cooking. The post-war immigration of Italians and Greeks would gradually change this, but that transformation happened slowly through the 1960s and 70s. Many suburban families maintained a vegetable patch in their backyard, a modest plot with tomatoes, lettuce, silver beet, beans, carrots, and herbs didn't require much space. Kids were often enlisted to help with watering and weeding. The vegetables you grew yourself were free, fresher than anything from shops, and they tasted better because you'd put work into them. Backyard veggie patches were common enough that most people knew several neighbours who grew food. Keeping chooks was another way families supplemented their food supply. A small coop with 3 or 4 hens provided fresh eggs daily. Kids learned to collect eggs each morning and feed the chooks scraps from dinner. The chooks ate vegetable peelings and leftovers, turning waste into eggs. When a hen stopped laying, she became Sunday's roast chicken. Nothing went to waste. The effort involved in growing, shopping for, and cooking food created a connection to what you ate. You understood where food came from. You knew the butcher by name. You'd watched tomatoes grow from seedlings in your own backyard. Food wasn't something anonymous that appeared in plastic packaging. It had a story, and you were part of that story. Cooking methods were simple and limited. You had a stovetop and an oven. That was it. No microwaves until the late 1970s, and even then they were expensive and uncommon. No slow cookers, no rice cookers, no air fryers. Boiling, roasting, frying, and baking covered everything you needed to do. Australian cooking reflected this simplicity. Vegetables were usually boiled, meat was roasted or fried, cakes were baked. Nothing fancy, just straightforward cooking techniques passed down from mothers to daughters. The women's role in the kitchen started changing in the 1960s and accelerated through the 70s. More married women began working outside the home, either part-time or full-time. This created pressure for quicker, easier meals. Convenience foods emerged to meet this need. Dried packet soups in 1951, frozen fish fingers in 1956, and eventually frozen complete meals in the late 1960s. These products promised to save time and effort for busy working women. Supermarkets fundamentally changed Australian shopping habits. The first supermarkets opened in 1960, with the large Coles New World format arriving in 1962. These stores sold groceries, meat, fruit, vegetables, dairy, and frozen foods all under one roof. You could do your entire shop in one trip, pushing a trolley down aisles and selecting items yourself rather than asking a shopkeeper to fetch things from behind the counter. The transition happened gradually enough that many people didn't notice how much had changed. In 1955, Cooking from scratch wasn't a choice, it was the only option. By 1975, you had choices. You could still cook everything yourself, or you could buy shortcuts. Each shortcut saved time, but also meant giving up some control over ingredients. More sugar, more salt, more preservatives crept into Australian diets through processed foods, even though people thought they were eating roughly the same way. Walking was simply how you got around. In 1963, only 35% of Australians owned a car. That meant most families relied on their feet or public transport for everything. You walked to the shops, you walked to work or to the train station. You walked to visit friends down the street. Children walked to school and home again, often a mile or two each way, every single day. This daily walking added up to serious physical activity without anyone thinking about it as exercise. A man might walk 20 minutes to the train station, work all day, walk 20 minutes home, then walk to the pub, and back in the evening. That's well over an hour of walking on a typical day. A woman might walk to 3 different shops carrying heavy bags home, walk children to school and back, walk to a friend's place for afternoon tea. Easily an hour or more of walking. Children's lives were filled with physical activity from morning to night. You walked to school with your mates. At recess and lunch, you played cricket, footy, or chasey. After school, you came home, dumped your bag, and went straight back outside to play until dinner. Weekends meant hours at the park, the creek, or the local oval. Nobody organised these activities. Kids just played because that's what kids did. By 1970, almost 70% of Australian children walked or cycled to school. Compare that to today, where barely 25% do. The shift is staggering. In the 60s and 70s, primary school kids as young as 6 or 7 would walk to school together without adult supervision. Parents trusted their kids to know the route and stay safe. The streets felt safer, and independence was encouraged early. Public transport required physical effort too. Catching a tram or bus meant walking to the stop, often several blocks, then walking from your stop to your final destination. Trains required walking through stations, up and down stairs. Unlike driving, which takes you door to door, public transport kept you on your feet. The incidental activity from using public transport added up significantly over a day. Work itself demanded physical exertion for most Australian men. Manufacturing, construction, farming, mining, and dock work employed millions. These jobs meant lifting heavy materials, standing all day, climbing ladders and scaffolding, working machines that required physical strength to operate. Miners spent entire shifts underground doing hard manual labour. Farmers worked long days in all weather, building fences, moving livestock, driving tractors over rough ground. Even office work involved more physical activity than today. There were no computers, no email, no instant messaging. If you needed to communicate with someone in another department, you walked to their desk. Filing meant walking to filing cabinets, pulling out heavy drawers, carrying folders back and forth. Copying documents meant using manual duplicating machines. Office workers weren't sitting at desks all day staring at screens. They were up and moving constantly. Factory work was physically demanding in ways modern Australians struggle to imagine. Assembly lines required standing in one spot for hours, repeating the same physical movements hundreds of times per shift. There was no automation for many tasks. Workers used hand tools, lifted heavy parts, packed boxes by hand, loaded trucks manually. By the end of a shift, you were genuinely tired because you'd done real physical work. Women's domestic work burned calories all day long. Washing clothes meant hauling heavy wet laundry from the copper, wringing it through a mangle by hand, carrying full baskets outside, and hanging everything on the clothesline. The heels hoist clothesline became an Australian icon in the 1950s, but you still had to carry wet washing out to it. Ironing meant standing for hours with a heavy iron, working through piles of shirts, sheets, and children's clothes. Floors didn't vacuum themselves. You got down on hands and knees to scrub kitchen and bathroom floors with a brush and bucket. Carpets got swept with a carpet sweeper or beaten outside to remove dirt. Windows were washed by hand with newspaper and vinegar. Beds needed making daily, which involved lifting heavy mattresses to tuck in sheets properly. Every task required physical effort and movement. Cooking demanded standing at the stove, stirring pots, bending to check ovens, carrying heavy casserole dishes, washing mountains of dishes by hand in the sink. No dishwashers meant at least 30 minutes of standing and scrubbing after each meal. Shopping trips involved carrying bags that could weigh 10 or 15 pounds when full of vegetables, meat, and groceries. Your arms ached by the time you got home. The outdoors generally pulled people out of their houses. Australia's climate meant you could be outside most of the year in many parts of the country. Backyards were for playing, not sitting. Parks filled with families on weekends. Kids climbed trees, built cubby houses, explored creeks and bushland. Nobody stayed inside staring at screens because screens barely existed. Television arrived in Sydney and Melbourne in time for the 1956 Olympics. Through the 60s, it spread across the country. Most families had one television by the late 1960s, and it changed evening routines. Instead of being outside or visiting neighbours, families gathered around the TV. This was the beginning of sedentary entertainment, though its effects wouldn't become fully apparent until later. Through most of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, though, Australian life kept people moving without any conscious effort. Walking, working, playing, doing household chores, it all added up to thousands of calories burned each week. Combined with smaller food portions and less constant eating, this natural activity level kept the population lean. The human body is designed to move regularly, and life in mid-century Australia provided exactly that.